we've got a situation now where, I mean, here we are, we're all walking around with these, these computers that would put the one on the lunar lander to shame. And yet, I wonder to what extent that has really made us a more informed citizenry, or is the fact that I no longer need to know how to get out of my neighborhood because I've got GPS to tell me how to get out of my neighborhood. Is it a little bit too easy? Should we, to what extent do we need to challenge ourselves to actually employ this to become more informed?
100%. I mean, I think it's really essential that we all understand that the gateway to knowledge begins but doesn't end with the smartphone. I mean, I was fortunate to come of age at a time when they were still publishing Encyclopedia Britannica. I mean, I'm an old fogey millennial. The kids who've just recently graduated the last 2 or 3 classes, and everyone who's an undergraduate here, and I understand there may be some graduate students and faculty community here as well, those folks are coming of age when the first search result is the beginning of a thesis. Instead of the data that's been amassed, or the scientific inquiry that's been amassed, or the interviews, the woman and man interviews on the street that have been amassed. And so, I think we just have to think about it from that frame of the devices being the entry point of ideas. But one thing I just wanted to elaborate on from the presentation is when I talked about deplatforming monetized misinformation and disinformation, I just want to clarify too, or add, that I think that when you facilitate workshops about how to speak to each other, it's important that we set some principles from the outset. So one of those principles can be that the technology is the starting point. But another one of those principles is if you begin a dialogue with someone and you are thrust instantly into a dehumanizing position, that the possibility of achieving civil discourse through that conversation may be bleak. Now, it's for all of us to decide, I think, with our due diligence and discretion, how far we want to take those exchanges. What makes us uncomfortable from the outset may actually lend itself to a 4 or 5 hour discussion, especially on a college campus, where you really do want to learn from each other. And it may be the case that what is emotional and not analytical is driving your point of view or your disposition. And so it's just so important, I think, we understand from each other that we all have resentments and aspirations. You're not human if you don't have some resentments and aspirations. And to think that only one cohort or only one class of people, has bias. Historically, there are examples of real disturbing prejudice and bigotry and xenophobia that are more overwhelming, and we have to be measured and honest in assessing intellectually which are more overwhelming. But I just wanted to clarify with respect to, I think that how we deplatform, dehumanizing discourse is really an essential question here.
Okay, let's hear from people.
Hi, just wanted to thank you for coming first. So kind of following what you were just saying about deplatforming and demonetizing, I would have to agree with you that maybe we should think about deplatforming or demonetizing misinformation, especially if it's from verified accounts, or if it's trending into libelous or defamatory type rhetoric. What I think where it gets dicey is where we start talking about deplatforming and demonetizing hate speech, and saying that the grounds for which, how far we choose to go in our conversation when we're discussing with each other is something for all of us to decide, but it's being decided by a small group of people who are running these websites. And I think the fear, at least that I have and what I can see happening, is the arbitration of the terms of services, the arbitration of what's hate speech and what's not hate speech, it's not being applied correctly, and it's forcing a lot of people off of these websites out of the public domain. I understand like Twitter and Facebook, these are private companies, but they're also utilities as well. And what's happening is we're sending a group of really, really angry people off to do, form their own groups and form their own websites online, and kind of mingling with people who also have been kicked off that maybe were kicked off for not as pervasive or dehumanizing speech. And I just kind of wanted to know your thoughts on that and what I just said.
Yeah. Thank you. Every one of these conversations is a slippery slope, right, insofar as protecting speech. But one thing we don't have to do, as long as we have and preserve the Constitution that we are fortunate to have, is say that these companies have to operate with the most purest First Amendment protection. I mean, in the sense that you just pointed out, they are private companies, publicly held, publicly traded companies, and their shareholders and ultimately all of their stakeholders, the users, can demand from them a certain ethic. Now, again, what that ethic is, right now across alphabet platforms, YouTube specifically, certainly Twitter and Facebook, there's been a disproportionate response and a lack of transparency in determining, what connotes hate and bigotry. I think my first objective is for some platform like YouTube to not have to deal with that most difficult question first. Why don't we deal with the question of fact and fiction? Because we have libraries in this country and on these campuses. And we can have YouTube, a search engine, it's really functioning for the post-millennial Gen Z as a search engine, and frankly for a lot of adults too. So, I think that YouTube has the right to say, here are sections that are news, here are sections that are fiction. And so let's start with that question, and the question of deliberating on, how do these companies enlist task forces that are going to assign what is bigotry. That is, I think, a more difficult question than just the question of whether or not I like to say it's Web 3.0, even though it's really gone backwards, right? Web 1.0 was when, we were just kind of experiencing the advent of this new technology on phone connections, right? 2.0, emerging platforms with high-speed internet. But in 1.0 and 2.0, dark shadows of chat rooms that were firing off hate speech that probably have incited violent attacks on people, not the most recent episodes, that did exist. But it was not mainstreamed in the way that, as long as the first thing a reporter does, whether it's in a newspaper article or on broadcast news, is cite Twitter, the fact that fake news is virally transmitted and deceiving people, right? That I like Kathleen Hall Jamieson, the communication scholar at Annenberg. Don't use the fake news term, use viral deception, because news, by definition, is real, right? So let's not conflate them in any way we shouldn't or have to. And I think that the first answer to your question is the answer to a different question, which is let's make these platforms more like libraries, because libraries are the stuff of civil society, not the Web 1.0, where those chat rooms have now been exploited to maintain some control or majority control, even though they represent a minority, because of how controversial they are or how hateful they are. So I think I would first deal with fact as a measure of how these social media companies are going to analyze their purpose if they really do want to connect us pro-socially. It's antithetical. You don't connect anti-socially, right? So there's the argument that anyone who believed in Facebook's mission and the idea that it was compatible with going into a publicly traded company, selling ads, Many of us remember signing up for Facebook when it really was a community of people who wanted to learn about each other, and they've tried to incorporate more of that now. But the fact that politics has become so entangled in social media, and that those dark corners of the web hijacked the controversy and meaning of social media, means we have to assess it. Again, not censor it necessarily, but take steps to assess it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I have a question similar to his, and so it has to do with this ferreting out hate speech and fake news. It seems to me hate speech, you can identify either words or ideas. You could even do it with artificial intelligence and might be able to block that. But with news, some of it is breaking news. Some of it is not. You can't go to a library and see if there other people have reported this. So is there a practical way of labeling news as real or fake if it's of a breaking time frame? And do you think the Facebook and similar sites have done all they can do in this respect, or is more regulation in order?
Well, no, and to that question, in the first question, yes. To the second question, they haven't done all they can. I mean, they haven't invited their shareholders to have an honest conversation about the problems that they've created in society. So, as long as these companies are governed by, in the case of Facebook, an owner who's a principal shareholder, basically he makes the governing decisions. Not all companies exist in that way. In other words, we as the public, as users, and in some cases as shareholders, can assert more pressure when you don't have a single owner who has the dominant shares and can run the ship as he or she pleases. You point out, I think, importantly, that there are no immediate correctives, even with artificial intelligence, when you look at the way artificial intelligence can do the opposite with deep fake videos, and the idea that you could put something up as breaking news from a verified source, and it could be looking at a video that seems like someone is saying something, and the technology is such that you can actually create a video of someone saying something they didn't say. I mean, it's a frightening
How can all
thing.
this be curated?
Yeah, I mean, but the thing is that Wikipedia is the gold standard, and everything that Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube have done sort of violates the idea of that you can facilitate a community dedicated to principally knowledge and the furtherance of knowledge. And so Wikipedia is that example as a nonprofit organization. Another example is Mozilla. I mean, when I was alluding before to our decisions and our digital footprint, that includes what browsers we use, because a nonprofit, the single most popular and really the only well-known nonprofit browser, Mozilla Firefox, now that has a different relationship with users and consumers than the vast majority of other browsers. I mean, certainly the commercial ones. And these kinds of decisions add up in whether we're surveilled and whether we are, living in a digital harmony or in a digital sort of death spiral. So I don't think there's one answer to your question other than, let's see these companies. Certainly the legislation proposed by the late Senator McCain and Senator Klobuchar and Senator Warner here, and Senator Warner has taken a lot of leadership in this respect with his own background in computing and technology. The idea being that these companies can incrementally absolve themselves of some of the corruption and misdeeds, but it takes learning, in learning from models that are not just driven by greed. And so can these companies better patrol viral deception and deceit online? Of course they can. They can employ their resources not to go to the moon and build colonies and skyscrapers, but they can gentrify our digital culture. I mean, it's always interesting to think about the after effect or the ramification, the consequence of industry when you don't want to deal with or even think about the blowback you wrought, and then you want to figure out the keys to society's next step, but not remember the oil spill or the tobacco carcinogens or what I describe very much as carcinogens of the mind. That when disinformation is disseminated on social media, just as dangerous to our health, our mental health, and our political well-being as cigarette makers and tobacco, to our lungs. So, I think we need a holistic picture, and the companies aren't thinking this way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's great to hear this conversation because I'm coming from Istanbul, Turkey. I just joined the Department of Sociology. I'm a sociologist, but I used to teach at Faculty of Communication in Istanbul. And we, as scholars, were afraid to post anything critical at Twitter or Facebook. You have a risk of losing your job. So I would like to ask you, what would you be your analysis in terms of the global dynamics at stake, especially in terms of the rise of authoritarian regimes all around the globe? Because it's not only about maybe loss of civil discourse, but there is actually a power dynamic. In Turkey, for example, mainstream media, TV channels, newspapers, more than 90% of it is now controlled by the Recep Tayyip Erdogan's authoritarian government, and business people who are getting sweet deals out of the bids and everything, including, by the way, the CNN's local joint venture in Turkey, CNN Turk, was recently taken over by a pro-government company. So there is this choking of the debate at the mainstream, TV channels, newspapers that we don't have in the U.S. Obviously, there is no, direct, intervention into the media industry, and also there is this shouting match in the Twitter and Facebook, and people could be prosecuted through their IP addresses and stuff. I mean, there are people who are imprisoned for simple comments and criticism of the Erdogan regime. And we also obviously see similar things in Hungary, Russia, etc. So what would be your take in terms of evaluating this global trend towards authoritarianism, especially in the lack of those checks and balances that U.S. does have?
Thank you. Can I ask you a question? Sorry, it's my nature.
Sure.
Would you say that climate existed before the coup attempt?
It did actually, since
2000. I mean, that's
yes.
historically what I would think, right?
Since Gezi Park protests in
Right.
2013. I mean, there was a
So-
liberal reform period until maybe roughly around 2010-12, and after that it has turned to the more negative.
So I think the global trends here are tough, and I'm so glad you can give the historical context to your students here and the kind of global picture of the fact that there are regimes where the operating software is demagogic or anti-democratic, but even worse, really despotic and government control of media. So, I think it's really a complicated question about global trends and media coverage. I think that the American press will do a disservice in 2020 if they operate from that same perspective, and if Donald Trump says something amusing or entertaining, that's the center, or if there's an uncritical parroting of his words, because that, in effect, has the result of state-sponsored government control. And when tweets are governing media coverage, and when you're not assessing whether there's a factual basis to a tweet, and the tweet is defining story after story of how the public is going to react to a news event or a campaign stop or a television ad, that's problematic. So, you have countries where they don't need social media to undevelop their democracy because the operating software is an undeveloped press or a government-sponsored press that's really not a free press. The only thing I thought of yesterday and have been thinking of recently from a geopolitical perspective that I think may be an original thought is that it must be puzzling when we think of brave and safe spaces for campus discourse for the South Koreans right now. To see an American president after decades of pausing any negotiation because of the horrors and the abomination of human rights, violations of human rights, that we have a new president, and that whether or not it is the truth, which Donald Trump attempts to explain, that we were averting crisis by beginning a negotiation, and Kim in North Korea they were on the verge of launching a nuclear attack against one of their neighbors. I mean, that's the sort of aura in which Trump likes to present it. But the bottom line is, from the perspective of an American culture and society that wants to uphold human rights, you know, it is really a dehumanizing idea to the South that you're going to entertain dialogue and deliberation and have, you know, hugs and kisses with each other when you see, you know, that what the North historically has done to, you know, massacre its own people and dissidents and you know, and forced labor and all those realities. So I would just say that from the broader global perspective, it's really an anomaly right now that America, in addition to being victim to the social media as authoritarians' best friends, are actually becoming best friends with authoritarians, or the precipice, the potential of friendships without preconditions, and you know, that's a bewildering thought. So in the same way, it's maybe dehumanizing on a college campus if you try to have a dialogue with someone and they want to deny your right to be here because of your citizenship status or your race or your religion. I think it's interesting to think of the crimes of the North and how the South is perceiving that right now. I mean, I think it's one of the most interesting questions. You would know more about how Turkey is related to in the larger conversation, but the rise of an anti-press, illiberal state is concerning, and the idea that sort of progressivism became conflated with liberal democracy is maybe the most troubling at all, because liberal democracy, according to political scientists and politicians at one point, was not about liberal outcomes or conservative outcomes in the way we think of it now. It was about rights-based diplomacy and leadership, constitutional republicanism being, you know, or democratic rule being a central facet of that. So somehow we have to unwind the trend that is allowing governments in Eastern Europe and elsewhere to identify illiberalism as meaning the opposite of modern-day liberals, Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn. That's not what it is, if you want to think of historically how political scientists have defined liberal democracy. And I would just say that Americans need to be hearing that, because that's what is the trend. And how we frame the conversation about rights is important.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you for your words in these responses. My question has to do with the echo chamber issue.
Sure.
Because I get what you're saying about the platforms, but you have something like Fox News, and you have the people who just listen to Fox News and just follow certain social media platforms, and there's no exposure one way or the other, there's no form of correction. And I don't know how you engage in discourse when you have two alternate sets of, if you can have alternate facts. Apparently you can, and that's my concern. So I wish you could talk about echo chambers and how you actually get people to engage on factual basis.
Right. Well, I kind of become a little more like my grandfather in my old age of not being too optimistic, you know, with respect to your question, because at the end of the day, you know, there are traumatic events that inspire resilience, and it's sort of a courage of mindset to kind of reset the culture of media, whether it's Fox News or MSNBC, or just those people who are going to target you instantly because of your party affiliation or the way that you've been cast. And so corporate leadership, not just of the social media companies, but what you're identifying is important, because it's not just the greed of the social media executives, it's any platform that is perpetuating misinformation and bigotry that I think is concerning to me. But I don't know if there is inspirational oratory in a public servant out there, or an activist, whether it's a John F. Kennedy or Martin Luther King Jr., that is investing an awful lot in the human grace and power of one person. But history is written that way, and how we as Americans respond to tragedy often unites our sense of that's kind of sensibility, that we are not operating in a Mars and a Venus, and we do live on one planet, and we can not just see eye to eye, but have some real factual agreement. I don't know if it's going to take a real wake-up call of that caliber, of that intensity, but I think the student response to the epidemic of gun violence has been encouraging, to reframe the debate sensibly and to think about the constitutionality of how we preserve a country in 2019, and how our amendments can comport with modern society, and giving people freedom but also protection is a big form of sustenance and freedom too. I don't think that you're going to reform a marketplace of ideas that's demonstrated in 10 years that falsehoods win or bigotry wins. I mean, that's just the history of the last decade when it comes to certain media properties. But can we reset without some calamity? I mean, I hope so. I know a lot of people are thinking that Vice President Biden can do that, but I know that people thought that Secretary Clinton could do that after a really tough campaign, and I don't see it right now, but I think there are people who are objecting to the kind of viciousness of the discourse that want to model positivity and mindfulness and a sort of new definition of spirituality in America. And I think if the Democrats don't embrace that idea that the majority of the country doesn't favor the Trumpian approach, then they're going to fail in a major way. But at the same time, I've been saying for a while, in this media climate, you do have to fight fire with fire. But what you don't have to do is fight bigotry with bigotry and lies with lies. And so President Obama's statement some months ago about how he's not an advocate of fighting fire with fire, I think missed the point entirely. It's not about the fire; it's about the substance of the fire, and in the intensity and the fervor with which you pursue a project, or your oratory can inspire. It can inspire civility. It can inspire uncivil discourse, political violence, and so I guess I would channel that idea of statesmen and womanship rising to the occasion, and I would hope that my peers in the journalistic profession would not view it as activist or ideological, and unfortunately too many of them do, to say how can we not just report on fact but help guide the country and sort of safeguard our discourse. And our episode this coming weekend with Susan Smith Richardson, the CEO of the Center for Public Integrity, is a lot about that, how we can safeguard the discourse to protect in 2020 against the kinds of things that you mentioned in your question.
Hi, thanks. Listen, as kind of as evidence of what we have here, about 2/3 of the audience fell off, and it's not a reflection on you, and it's not a reflection on the topic. I think it's more a reflection on American civilization and where voters are these days. And what do you think that the media can do to stimulate more people to be more involved? I mean, here you've got, we would have a whole different conversation tonight if less than 80,000 people voted differently in 3 states in 2016. So what I posit to you is that what really matters is...
Did you say we would have a different conversation if that happened?
Well, I think, yes, because I think we would have a different president, is my point.
But we were having this conversation. I mean, I've been going around the country talking about civil discourse since
decades.
Trump announced. So, just...
Well, it's been for decades as well. I think it's kind of heated up, and they used to have...
Maybe since before he announced, too, but I'm sorry. Go
Right.
ahead.
No, and I think in politics, we used to have people have duels and things. But
Yeah.
the point I'm trying to make is that instead of the pool of voters who actually vote, instead of getting them to just vote a little differently, the squishy
Right.
middle, what can the media do to increase that whole pool?
Right.
There's
right.
a forest and the trees argument. I think we keep on throwing trees, and a lot of people don't understand the forest. But
Right.
Anyway.
Well, I mean, historically, I think it's fair to say, as the dean said, there has been the incompatibility of civility and politics by virtue of the fact that politics can be manipulative and position you in a warlike posture, and it's about protecting your hide, your power, and sometimes accumulating more and not serving the public in the process. I'm a huge advocate of democratization of electoral processes so that we are not just more interactive with each other, but that we participate legislatively in governance. So there's a great movement out of organizations that are attempting to facilitate, especially on the local and state level where it's more plausible and has been accomplished, more of that citizen participation in governance. And that's the first idea, because whether you are dealing with a local zoning issue in your neighborhood, or you're dealing with something bigger, like the way the community hospital is responding to an outbreak of a certain disease or is providing medical attention. I mean, these conversations are constant, and they require all of us, as does this, I mentioned, epidemic and disease. I mean, this conversation about vaccinations and the importance of community members to advocate for scientific truths. And part of it is about framing. I just don't think we're imaginative enough. And yes, it's harder to make the structural changes like reforming the Second Amendment so that it allows people to have their rifles or muskets for shooting, for wildlife and not endangered species, but the hunting lifestyle, and that the Second Amendment can be compatible with the hunting lifestyle and still protect us from huge proliferation of guns. But we've been unimaginative both structurally and linguistically, right? I mean, there's no speech you hear Trump give, and these days, and maybe you could say Obama channeled this more, where the rhetoric was imaginative and thoughtful, and it really gave inspiration to the idea that we all are participating in democracy. So there are a variety of ways structurally that people can become more involved: initiatives, referenda, local school board elections and decisions. I mean, I'm a huge advocate of people power in democracy, because that's the only way it can be infused with real life. But I disagree with the premise of the idea that civility would not be a center stage, and that the media and the modus operandi of social media amusing our democracy to death. That phenomenon is, Trump is a perfect agent to accomplish it, but someone else could, and someone could do it quite more malevolently too.
I guess the only thing I was trying to make, and I wasn't trying to make that particular argument,
Yeah.
was that before social media, we had these same things occur. Just social media has given people tools.
Right.
and those tools they can use.
Right, and we had the same phenomenon where you'd invite people to a town hall meeting, and if there was a war being debated, I remember being in a town hall meeting with Marty Meehan. I went to school in New York and Massachusetts, and he was one of the courageous souls, at least in the auspices of the town hall, arguing against continuing to pursue the war in Iraq, and that was a jam-packed town hall. There wasn't one seat. There was standing room only. People outside away. So, this idea of the stakes and rising to the occasion is important if you're going to facilitate people to undertake democracy themselves. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, we're gonna have one more question, and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you for coming, man. I
Yeah,
appreciate
thanks.
it.
Thank you.
So I have a question on the conceptual limits of both right-wing and left-wing sides of politics. So if you think about the right wing, or the way I think about it is, say that society's a hierarchy, right? There are people at the top, people at the bottom. I think the right wing represents that the hierarchy is competent. The people at the top should be at the top because they work harder or for whatever reason, and the people at the bottom are there because they haven't risen up yet. And if you look at the left side of things, the left represents because there's a hierarchy, it dispossesses people. So the left represents those people that are dispossessed. Now, in the past 100 years, both sides have gone too far, Nazism and communism. And I think with Nazism, it's really, really easy to recognize, because what that is someone saying, if you're not in our hierarchy, you're out. You're gone, you're dead, you're nothing for us. I don't see that characterization as being easily recognized the same way on the left side of things. So I'm wondering, where do you think the left has gone too far?
Where do you think it's gone too far?
I think it's probably a combination of things.
I think that would be helpful in responding to your prompt. I mean, I don't know if there's a specific example you want to give. I know that that kind of, that's one way to analyze world affairs today, these kind of meta, like, charts and graphs of describing how movements emerge under the guise of socialism or communism or materialism I'm more concerned with some of, like, the important distinctions we draw, like the Scandinavian countries, for instance, right, representing a higher degree of socialism than, and frankly, we could say the UK and Canada in certain respects, certainly Canada, and achieving civil society and not eliminating swaths of people, right?
Yeah.
So this is all to say that, I think my criteria is less in terms of capitalistic and socialistic, and again, more in terms of human rights.
Okay.
Right, and so you can possess human rights in a socialistic experience. You can possess human rights in a capitalistic experience, and I think the structure you define is a way that people want to cast extremism in the if you further an agenda one way or another, because you can have crony capitalists and you can have crony communists.
That's true.
So what's the point? The point is that we should focus on human rights and people's well-being. And sometimes that requires government, sometimes not, sometimes private-public partnership, sometimes not. And then look at the realities. Like, we had social mobility when Eisenhower was president. And we might have had a less diverse campus here, and we are striving in this country for a pluralistic multiculturalism that everyone invests in America.
Right.
If you acknowledge the dignity of America, America ought to acknowledge your dignity, right? If you work hard for this country, whether you're in government or the private sector, whatever it may be. And so, people, again, comes back to language and imagination and framing. And I think if you speak in those truths, like, about social mobility and oligarchy in particular, because the folks in Russia would continue to say that they operate under the guise of what is capitalism, but it really is just a resurgence of the cronyism of a communist system, whereby the end product is not just cronyism, but just mass oligarchy that denies people relevance and economic opportunity. And you could say that here too, even though we have a more fully functioning democratic system where folks are going to go out on the street and they're not going to be tear gassed like in Hong Kong. They're not going to be beaten up like they are on the streets in Moscow, right? So let's just not divvy things up in ways that are just going to be so counterproductive.
Okay, gotcha.
Thank
Appreciate the
you.
answer. No, I
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you've given us a lot to unpack, and we very, very much appreciate you coming to VCU and offering your thoughts and some real compelling arguments and questions that we can use in the future to try to address this whole idea of being more civil in an uncivil age. So thank you very much, Alexander Heffner, for joining us.
Thank you.